Come see us on tour in Cohoes, New York, Los Angeles, Bakersfield, San Jose, Buffalo, Toledo, Montreal, and Toronto. Go to jimmydore.com for the cheapest tickets.
The Russian envoy to the U.S., his name is Kirill Dmitriev, and he is in the U.S. for talks with senior U.S. officials from the Trump administration, also in Congress as well. And he went on Fox News to talk about the progress so far of these negotiations toward ending the proxy war in Ukraine.
The talks right now and how they're going?
I think President Trump administration has made tremendous progress. There was no dialogue with Russia in Biden administration for the last 3 years. There was no trying to understand Russian position. There was no really solutions that could have been successful. And what President Trump team has done, they understood what the solution space may be, and they achieved the first de-escalation ever in the conflict, which is stopping hits on energy infrastructure between Russia and Ukraine. So we are having good discussions. Our diplomatic people are also discussing possible outcomes, but there is no question that President Trump team not only stopped World War III from happening, but also had already achieved sizable progress on Ukraine resolution.
So he says two important things there. First of all, he says the Trump administration is doing what the Biden administration refused to do, which is talk. The Biden administration wouldn't even speak to Russia while fueling a massive proxy war in Ukraine against it. But then he says the Trump administration, in talking to Russia, has helped avoid World War III. And you might hear that and think, okay, he's exaggerating. He's doing that to flatter Trump. Well, guess what? There are people inside the Biden camp who thought the exact same thing as well. That's a takeaway from a new article in the New York Times called The Partnership: The Secret History of the War in Ukraine. It's based on interviews with dozens of officials from the U.S. and other NATO countries that were behind the proxy war in Ukraine. And there are many revelations in there, including this, talking about the Biden administration's decision to continually cross its own red lines and provide weapon systems to Ukraine that it previously had ruled out. And that includes HIMARS. So here, the Times quotes Celeste Wallander, who was under Biden, the Assistant Defense Secretary for International Security Affairs. And she quotes Mark Milley, General Mark Milley, the former chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And she says, Milley would always say, you've got a little Russian army fighting a big Russian army, and they're fighting the same way, and the Ukrainians will never win. But then she says, by contrast to Milley's argument, General Christopher Cavoli, who was the commander of forces in Europe, he argued that with HIMARS, this missile system, the Ukrainians can fight like we can, and that's how they will start to beat the Russians. So if we just give them our weapon systems, then Ukraine will be on our level, on the US's level, and then we can beat the Russians, okay? And then, listen to this. At the White House, Joe Biden and his advisors weighed that argument against fears that pushing the Russians would only lead Mr. Putin to panic and widen the war. When the generals requested HIMARS, one official recalled, the moment felt like, quote, standing on that line, wondering if you take a step forward, is World War III going to break out? And guess what? They took that step forward of authorizing these weapon systems to Ukraine, even though they were wondering, is this going to cause World War III? So they took steps that they were not sure could avoid World War III. They're willing to risk World War III just for their proxy war against Russia. And the New York Times goes on, the unthinkable had become real. The U.S. was now woven into the killing of Russian soldiers on sovereign Russian soil. Yes, that's right. The Biden administration took steps that made the U.S. part of a killing machine against Russians on Russian soil, because eventually, because the Biden administration kept crossing its own red lines, they were involved not just in attacking Russian forces on Ukrainian soil, but also Russian forces across the border inside of Russia. And here are some of the key takeaways from this piece, which the Times helpfully put together. A U.S. base in Wiesbaden, Germany, supplied the Ukrainians with the coordinates of Russian forces on their soil. So contrary to the widespread view that this was a war between Ukraine and Russia, this actually was a war between Russia against Ukraine and the U.S., with the U.S. choosing the targets for Ukraine from Germany nearby, from a U.S. base in Germany. So at a base in Germany, the U.S. was choosing which targets Ukraine would hit and then giving them to the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians would strike them. So basically, it was the U.S. running the war from behind the scenes. Here's another takeaway. The Biden administration kept moving its red lines. From the first, administration officials sought to lay down a red line. America was not fighting Russia. It was helping Ukraine. Still, they worried that steps taken to accomplish that might provoke Putin to attack NATO targets or perhaps make good on his nuclear threats. Even as the administration developed an ever greater tolerance of risk to help Ukraine meet the evolving threat, many of the most potentially provocative steps were taken in secret. So, yes, we're not fighting Russia. On the other hand, we're going to fight Russia, but just do it in secret and hope that nobody notices, including Russia, which, of course, Russia knew along that we were doing. In 2000, here's an example of the U.S. moving its red lines. In 2002, the U.S. Navy was authorized to share targeting information for Ukrainian drone strikes on warships just beyond the territorial waters of Russian annexed Crimea. The CIA was allowed to support Ukrainian operations within Crimean waters. That fall, the spy agency covertly helped Ukrainian drones strike Russian warships in the port of Sevastopol. So the CIA, the New York Times now admits, of course, way after the fact, was involved in attacking Russian ships inside of Crimea, which Russia seized in 2014 after the U.S. backed a coup in Kyiv. So now we learn after the fact just a new aspect of how dangerous this was, that the CIA was being involved in targeting Russian ships. Here's more. In January 2024, U.S. and Ukrainian military officers in Wiesbaden in Germany jointly planned a campaign using coalition-supplied long-range missiles, along with Ukrainian drones, to attack about 100 Russian military targets across Crimea. The campaign, named Operation Lunar Hail, largely succeeded in forcing the Russians to pull equipment, facilities, and forces in Crimea back to the Russian mainland. So, Malcolm, let me bring you in here. Now, of course, I mean, we've been saying this all along. We've covered this endlessly here on the Jimmy Dore Show, as we have also at Gray Zone, that the U.S. was actively involved as a belligerent in this war. This idea that we were just helping the Ukrainians, giving them the equipment they needed, that was always a farce. We were running this war from behind the scenes. And now it takes a long time, but the New York Times comes out with a very long piece confirming it.
Well, I think you're failing to factor in one important aspect, which is that it's not just a matter of us supplying Ukraine with the weapons of war they need to wage this war, but we need to supervise closely what they're doing, because left to their own devices, they'll just sell them on the black market. They won't even attack Russia. So you're criticizing the CIA for just doing their due diligence by making sure that they actually use the weapons we give them instead of selling them, often winding up facing back against them, by a circuitous route. So I think that's what you need to factor in also, Aaron. I'm not to criticize.
So the CIA stands for fiscal responsibility, basically.
Fiscal responsibility.
Yeah.
I mean, when your kid turns 15 and gets or 16 and gets their driver's license, you don't just throw them the keys and say, "Hey, knock yourself out." You want to drive with them, make sure they're going, driving properly and not, getting drunk and driving. You got to supervise,
Right.
And I think if that is, I'm joking, of course, but that is an actual lesson of the early parts of this war, which is that a lot of the weaponry that we provided to Ukraine was just sold off to enrich the, Ukrainian oligarchs. That's not your point, I know, but.
Here's another takeaway from the New York Times. Ultimately, the U.S. military and CIA were allowed to help with strikes into Russia. We were directly assisting, in fact, overseeing strikes, not just on Russian forces instead of Ukraine, but strikes into Russia. And, looking back on it now, Russia practiced restraint. Imagine if Russia had decided to hit back at the same U.S. forces that were helping Ukraine strike into Russia. It would have been the World War III that these officials feared. Russia thankfully restrained itself, but had they not, it would have been even more disastrous. And here's one of the key architects of this U.S. assistance policy of running the war from behind the scenes, General Christopher Cavoli. And watch him talk at a congressional hearing about the effectiveness of U.S.-backed missile strikes by Ukraine at Russian forces.
How effective have the long-range missiles that we've allowed Ukrainians to shoot into Russia, how effective has that been?
Very.
In all areas?
Yeah, they've been extremely effective, sir. I could go into this in private session, but the United States makes some very good weaponry, and it's the ones we've donated have been very, very effective. In closed session, I'd be happy to talk to you about a few of the things they've done with it.
Now, why is he so happy to go talk about this in closed session? Is because in public session, he doesn't want to admit that he's the one running the war from behind the scenes. He's the one telling Ukraine what to strike, which Russian forces to hit. And that has to be kept in secret away from the public, because if the public maybe knew that the U.S. was secretly running the war in Ukraine, they might have some feelings about it and might be objecting. And that's why he had to talk about it in closed session.
Well, I like that he said, he's asked, how effective have they been? And he says very. And then the senator asks for clarification, and he says extremely. So, not, I don't want to just leave it at very and let you draw your own conclusions. It's also extremely effective. But but what you were saying before about how the Russians and Putin have actually shown restraint, it seems like the waging of this war has been a steady process of pushing things as close as possible to World War III without getting over that. And those red lines that the Biden administration was establishing were also sort of red lines to see if, is this going to get to World War III? No? Okay, I guess we can get a little farther. And it's like, just how much can we enrich our military contractor donors without us all, without bringing about the extinction of humanity? And, I think credit to them. They've done a pretty good job, Aaron. But the other thing is that the talking points about Putin are always that he's a madman. He's this crazed Putin. He can't be right. He's the only sane one who has prevented this from becoming World War III.
That's correct.
We've been depending on Putin, not being the way we describe him to the American people.
That's exactly right. While claiming that Putin is a madman who wants to take over Europe or the rest of the world, they've been relying on him to be restrained. Because as this article in the New York Times points out, it's not Russia that kept crossing its own red lines. It was the U.S. that kept crossing its own red lines. We heard so much about Putin's red lines and how he hasn't enforced them, so therefore it's okay to keep sending weapons to Ukraine. Putin actually didn't set out red lines. The U.S. set out red lines, and one of the red lines for Biden was we don't want to fight Russia directly, but they kept threatening it by moving over their own red lines, including, because Biden initially said, we're not going to give Ukraine weapons that can strike into Russia. We're not going to give them these long-range weapons. He crossed that every single time because he was so desperate to keep the proxy war going. And why? We know now, they all admitted it was not even to help Ukraine. It was to weaken Russia. And so to weaken Russia, the Biden administration was willing to not only sacrifice Ukraine, but risk World War III. And 3 years later, the New York Times finally comes out and admits it, thereby catching up with those of us who've been saying this from the very start.
I know that the New York Times reporters, one of their key sources is Jimmy Dore show 3 years ago. So they just watch old episodes and they're like, oh, this is interesting. We should write about this.
Come see us on tour in Cohoes, New York, Los Angeles, Bakersfield, San Jose, Buffalo, Toledo, Montreal, and Toronto. Go to jimmydore.com for the cheapest tickets.